My ex dumped me 3 days before my birthday for a guy with a BMW, then showed up 5 years later, begging for 20K when karma finally caught up to her. I need to preface this by saying I never thought I'd be the kind of person with a story like this. But here we are, and honestly, typing it all out has been more cathartic than I expected, so bear with me because it's long and I want to get the details right, because the details are kind of the whole point. 3 days before I turned 26, my girlfriend of 4 years, a woman named Renata, sent me a text message instead of talking to me in person, and the text said she needed someone with actual ambition who could give her the kind of life she deserved. And that person, it turned out, was a guy named Trent, who worked in commercial real estate leasing, drove a leased BMW 4 Series he couldn't really afford, and wore a Tag Heuer watch he definitely couldn't afford either. At the time, I was a second-year HVAC apprentice making $18 an hour, living in a 500-square-foot studio above a laundromat, and to Renata that apparently translated to no vision, no drive, no future, which were words she used in the actual breakup text because apparently even the breakup itself wasn't worth a phone call. Within 2 weeks, she'd moved into a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs with Trent, blocked my number, and according to mutual friends had told at least a dozen people that I was emotionally stunted and content to just coast through life, which stung more than the breakup itself, if I'm honest, because I'd spent 4 years being genuinely supportive of her and thought we were building something real. For the first 6 months after that, I was a mess. I'm not going to pretend I handled it gracefully. I gained 15 pounds, missed 2 apprenticeship exams I had to retake, and spent way too many nights parked outside her new place like an idiot, which I'm not proud of, but it happened. What actually snapped me out of it was my older brother Desmond, who drove 4 hours to my apartment one weekend, found me surrounded by pizza boxes, and instead of coddling me, just sat down and said, "The best revenge isn't a scene, it's a life she has to hear about secondhand and hate herself over." That sentence rearranged something in my brain. I didn't cry about it. I didn't spiral further. I just sort of quietly decided that from that point forward, I was going to build something undeniable, not to prove anything to Renata specifically, but because I realized I'd been coasting in a relationship that told me coasting was all I was capable of, and I wanted to know what I was actually capable of. So I got my head down. I finished my apprenticeship hours, tested for my journeyman license, and picked up every overtime shift, every weekend emergency call, every holiday nobody else wanted to work, for almost 2 years straight. I lived like a monk. I ate rice and beans and canned chicken. I didn't go on a single vacation. By 28, I had saved enough for a down payment on a rundown duplex on the east side of the city, a place with a leaking roof and knob and tube wiring that scared off every other buyer at the auction. I gutted half of it myself on nights and weekends, learned to do basic drywall and flooring from YouTube videos, and rented out both units within 4 months. That was the first domino. By 29, I'd picked up a second property, a small triplex near the community college that I financed using the equity and rental income from the first place. By 31, after passing my master HVAC license and taking a lead technician position with a commercial contractor that paid nearly double what I'd made as an apprentice, I owned 5 rental properties total, 4 residential and 1 small mixed-use building with a laundromat on the ground floor, which felt like a nice poetic little detail given where I'd started. Somewhere in that stretch, at 30, I met Priya at a friend's engagement party. She worked as a physical therapist, was sharp and funny and completely unbothered by my work schedule, and unlike Renata, she actually asked questions about my rental properties because she was curious, not because she was calculating anything. We started dating slowly, moved at our own pace, and by the time I was 32, we'd been together 2 years, and things felt steady in a way my relationship with Renata never had, even at its best. I want to be clear that I hadn't thought about Renata in any real sense for years by that point. Not out of some heroic act of forgiveness, just genuine indifference, the kind that only comes from actually moving on. Which is why what happened next caught me so completely off guard. It turns out that Trent, the BMW driving commercial leasing guy, was exactly as substantial as a guy who leases a BMW he can't afford tends to be. According to what I later pieced together from mutual friends who still talk to Renata, Trent quit his leasing job about a year and a half after she moved in with him to become a day trader, which lasted maybe 8 months before he lost a significant chunk of what savings they had between them. From day trading, he pivoted to being a life coach, which, as far as anyone could tell, mostly consisted of posting inspirational quotes over stock photos of mountains, and when that predictably went nowhere, he decided he needed to find his passion, which is a phrase that should set off alarm bells in any relationship, and it apparently did nothing for Renata's alarm bells at all. Through all of this, Renata was reportedly the one covering the mortgage on the suburban house, because Trent's various pivots never quite generated income. They mostly generated Instagram content. About 2 years before any of this circled back to me, Trent found his actual passion, which was a 24-year-old woman named Sierra he met at a hot yoga studio. He didn't have the decency to have an actual conversation about it. He packed a duffel bag over the course of a week while Renata was at work, moved into Sierra's apartment, and stopped contributing to the mortgage roughly 8 months before he left entirely, meaning Renata had unknowingly been carrying the full weight of that house for the better part of a year without realizing her boyfriend had 1 foot out the door the whole time. I only learned all of this later, piece by piece, but I'm including it now because it matters for understanding just how unraveled things had gotten for her by the time she resurfaced in my life. The resurfacing happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I was up on a lift replacing a rooftop condenser unit at one of the properties I manage, my newest one, a small fourplex I'd picked up the year before, when my current tenant Ellis waved me down and said someone was asking for me at the front gate. I climbed down thinking it was a delivery or a city inspector, and instead there was Renata, standing by the curb in a cardigan that looked 2 sizes too big, hair pulled back in a way that looked more like neglect than style, looking nothing like the polished woman who'd blocked my number 6 years earlier. She'd apparently gotten my work address from a mutual friend, Casey, who I later found out felt guilty enough about it to actually apologize to me directly. Renata told me almost immediately, without any real preamble, that her house was going into foreclosure, that she was 3 months behind on the mortgage after Trent left her holding the entire bill, and that she needed $20,000 to catch up on payments and stop the bank from taking the house. She said it like it was a foregone conclusion that I would help, like 6 years, and a cruel breakup text hadn't happened, like we were still the same 2 people who used to split grocery bills in that studio above the laundromat. I'll be honest, I was so blindsided by the whole interaction, standing there in a hard hat with sweat still on my neck from the rooftop unit, that I didn't say no outright. What I said, verbatim, was, "Let me think about it," mostly because my brain hadn't caught up to what was happening, and I needed her gone so I could process it. That, I would learn very quickly, was a catastrophic mistake, because to Renata, "Let me think about it," wasn't a neutral, non-committal response. It was apparently a green light. The very next morning, the messages started. Not 1 or 2, but a steady stream, 3 to 4 a day at first, each one wildly different in tone from the last. One message would be tearful and nostalgic, reminding me of a time back when I was an apprentice and she'd stayed up with me the night before a licensing exam quizzing me on wiring codes, as though that single supportive night somehow erased everything that came after. The next message, sometimes within the same hour, would flip entirely, accusing me of being cold, of having become someone who only cares about money now, of abandoning her when she needed me most, as if we had any ongoing relationship to abandon. It was disorienting, the emotional whiplash of it, going from being reminded of tender memories to being called heartless within the span of 20 minutes. Within a week, it escalated past text messages. She started calling the direct line for my HVAC company, which I'd given out to exactly nobody outside professional contacts, so I have no idea how she got it, though I suspect it was through the same friend group. She called while I was up on a ladder pulling ductwork at a job site, and I had to awkwardly excuse myself in front of a client to decline the call. She left voicemails, 3 of them over the course of one afternoon, and the tonal shifts within those voicemails alone were something else entirely. The first one soft and pleading, the second one sharp and accusatory, cursing at me for playing games. The third one, left 20 minutes later, back to crying and apologizing for the second one. It read less like someone asking a former partner for help, and more like someone completely unraveling in real time. And while some small part of me felt a flicker of pity, that pity evaporated fast once the behavior kept escalating. The worst single stretch came about 10 days in. I was asleep, phone on silent but visible from across the room. And when I woke up at 6 in the morning, there were 17 unread messages, most of them sent between 2 and 3:15 in the morning. I still remember opening them with this pit in my stomach, scrolling through walls of text sent at 2:03, 2:11, 2:19, then a gap, then another burst at 2:47, then a final cluster starting at 3:15, the content ranging from guilt-tripping about how I clearly had the money since I owned multiple properties, to outright insults calling me selfish and heartless for letting her lose everything over what she framed as pocket change to me. Reading that at 6 in the morning, half awake, genuinely rattled me in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't the ask for money that bothered me anymore at that point. It was the sheer volume, the middle-of-the-night compulsiveness of it, that made it feel less like a financial request and more like something closer to obsession. That same week, I finally responded with something direct instead of my usual vague deflections. I wrote a short, unambiguous message telling her that I would not be lending her any money, that our relationship ended 6 years ago, and that I needed her to stop contacting me entirely, on any platform, through any channel. Her response was immediate and came in the form of what I can only describe as a wall of text, message after message within seconds of each other, calling me vindictive, calling me cruel, saying I was getting off on watching her suffer, which was such a wild inversion of reality that I genuinely sat there rereading it, trying to figure out if she believed what she was typing. The following day, while I was replacing a water heater at my East Side duplex, the same property where all this really started with the original renovation years earlier, I walked outside during a break to grab a part from my truck and found her car already parked across the street, clearly waiting for me. She got out before I could even process what was happening, and the crying started almost instantly, this desperate, genuine-seeming plea for us to get back together, weaving in and out of the money request as though the two things were the same conversation. When I calmly told her no, that ship had sailed years ago, and this had nothing to do with money at all anymore, her whole demeanor flipped in about 4 seconds flat, the tears drying up mid-sentence, replaced by this cold, cutting anger where she started throwing my own words from when I was 24 back at me, reminding me I'd once told her I'd do anything for her, using a promise from a completely different chapter of my life as some kind of binding contract she was now trying to collect on. I didn't argue. I just got back in my truck, rolled up the window while she was still talking, and drove off, hands shaking on the wheel the entire drive back to the shop. If it had stopped there, at me being harassed directly, I honestly think I could have just kept absorbing it and moving on with gritted teeth. What actually pushed me to get serious about it was when she started pulling other people into it. First it was Priya. Renata found her Instagram, which wasn't hard since Priya's profile was public, and sent her a message that was dressed up as concern, something along the lines of being worried about me and just wanting to make sure I was doing okay, which on its surface reads almost innocuous, except Priya immediately recognized it for the manipulation attempt it was, especially once she connected the dots on who was sending it. To Priya's enormous credit, she didn't panic or get jealous. She screenshotted everything, showed me immediately, and calmly said something I'll never forget, which was, "This isn't about you being unfaithful. This is about her trying to make you doubt yourself. Don't give her that." Then Renata showed up again at the duplex, this time when I wasn't even there, and cornered Ellis, my tenant, in the parking lot, asking him invasive questions about my schedule, whether I lived with anyone, how much money I actually made from the properties, questions that had nothing to do with any legitimate reason for her to be talking to my tenant at all. Ellis called me immediately afterward, clearly rattled, telling me some woman had shown up asking weirdly specific and personal questions about me, and that was the moment something shifted from, "This is exhausting and upsetting," to, "This is genuinely a safety and boundary problem that involves other people now." Around the same time, she also started posting vague, pointed things on Facebook, the kind of posts clearly aimed at me but written to sound like general reflections on heartbreak and betrayal. Things like, "Isn't it funny how the people who claim they've changed are often the cruelest?" framed in a way that painted her as the wronged party currently suffering some fresh injustice at my hands. Because we still shared a decent number of mutual friends from years back, several of them saw the posts, connected the dots, and started reaching out to me directly asking what was going on, which meant I was now fielding concerned messages from people I hadn't talked to in years on top of everything else, having to explain a situation I hadn't asked to be part of. That was the point where Priya and Desmond both, independently of each other, told me the same thing. Stop trying to handle this quietly and start documenting it like it's evidence, because that's exactly what it was becoming. I started screenshotting every single message the moment it came in, kept a running log with dates and times of every phone call, every voicemail, every time she physically showed up somewhere, cross-referencing it against my own work schedule to show a clear pattern. Priya helped me organize it into an actual timeline document, which in hindsight probably should have felt excessive at the time, but ended up being exactly the right move. On Desmond's recommendation, I found an attorney named Gordon Wexler, who specialized in harassment and stalking cases, a guy who'd apparently handled a fair number of similar situations and didn't seem remotely fazed by mine when I laid it all out for him in our first consultation. He reviewed the entire timeline I'd built, nodded along like he'd heard versions of this dozens of times before, and told me the pattern of escalating unwanted contact combined with the workplace and third-party intrusions gave us more than enough to send a formal cease and desist letter, which he said would establish a clear legal record even if it didn't stop the behavior outright, though in his experience it usually did at least slow things down significantly. The letter cost me $500 to have drafted and sent, itemizing every documented instance of contact with specific dates, explicitly warning that continued contact could result in a restraining order and potential legal action, and it went out via certified mail so there would be a signed record of receipt. For about 4 days after she signed for that letter, nothing happened, which was almost more unsettling than the constant contact had been, this eerie silence after weeks of near-daily chaos. Then, on the 5th day, a single final message came through. Short, cold, nothing like the desperate pleading or the furious accusations from before, just a flat line about how karma has a way of finding people, and that I would get what's coming to me eventually. Gordon's advice when I told him about it was simple, and frankly, exactly what I needed to hear. Don't respond, don't engage, document it and move on, and consider deleting or locking down my social media for a while just to remove any easy access points for her to keep monitoring my life from a distance. I took that advice fully, deactivated the accounts I barely used anyway, and for the first time in almost 2 months, I actually started to feel my nervous system settle back down. About 2 months after the cease and desist letter went out, I happened to be driving past the old suburban neighborhood, not intentionally, just a route that overlapped with a job I was quoting nearby, and I saw a foreclosure notice sign staked into the front lawn of the house Renata and Trent used to share. I didn't feel triumphant seeing it, which surprised me a little. I mostly just felt this strange, distant sort of finality, like watching a chapter close that had already been closed for me for a while. Through the same mutual friend grapevine that had kept me half-informed this whole time, I eventually heard that Renata ended up losing the house entirely and moved back in with her parents out of state, essentially starting over from nothing in her mid-30s, which is a genuinely difficult and humbling place to land. And I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing hearing that, but what I felt mostly was relief that it was finally, actually over, and a strange kind of quiet sadness for the person she used to be before all of this, rather than any real satisfaction at her expense. I finished paying off Gordon's invoice a few weeks later, closing that particular chapter administratively as well as emotionally. My accountant, going over my numbers around the same time for a routine quarterly check-in, told me the rental portfolio had grown enough over the past year that I comfortably qualified for financing on a 6th property, a small commercial strip unit I'd had my eye on for a while, which felt like an almost absurdly well-timed piece of good news landing right as the other mess was finally clearing out of my life. Priya and I moved in together not long after, into a bigger 2-bedroom place with enough extra space that she finally has a proper home office for her practice's paperwork instead of doing it at the kitchen table, which had been a running joke and mild point of friction between us for a while. We had a small housewarming that fall, nothing extravagant, just Desmond and his wife, a handful of Priya's co-workers, a couple guys from my crew who'd become genuine friends over the years. The kind of gathering that felt warm and unforced in a way that made me appreciate exactly how far removed my life now was from where it started. Priya got a promotion to lead therapist at her clinic around the same time, and somewhere in the middle of all that good momentum, we started seriously talking about buying a place of our own with an actual yard, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't been quietly shopping for rings, because I have been, and I think she suspects it, and honestly, I don't mind that she does. A few weeks ago, I was cleaning out an old filing box from the garage and found a single photo from years back, one I didn't even realize I still had. Renata and me at some barbecue in our early 20s, both of us looking impossibly young and completely unaware of everything that was coming. I looked at it for a while, not with anger, not really with sadness either, just this quiet sort of recognition, and then I threw it away. Not dramatically, not as some big cathartic gesture, just a normal decision on a normal Tuesday, tossed in with a stack of old receipts and expired warranties. I realized somewhere in that moment that I genuinely don't carry any resentment toward her anymore. Not because what she put me through wasn't real or didn't hurt, but because I'm just too far along building something good to have room left over for holding on to something that small. What I feel now, mostly, is gratitude. Weirdly enough. Gratitude that a breakup text 3 days before my 26th birthday forced me to figure out who I actually was capable of becoming. Gratitude that I learned how to set an actual boundary and enforce it with paperwork and follow-through instead of just hoping a problem would quietly resolve itself. And gratitude that I ended up eventually exactly where I am now, with people around me who showed up consistently instead of only when it was convenient for them. That's really the whole story. It took a long time and a $500 letter from a very patient lawyer to get here, but I got here.